So in this video I'm going to show you how to do your own version of a David Hockney landscape. So this is going to be our inspiration with David Hockney's paintings, and the second option that you can do with pencil if you don't have coloured pens at home. So I'm going to start off by doing 3 rows of hills in my landscape. So the first row that I'm doing are the ones in the background. So these are the furthest away from me. So I want them to look smaller, so I'm adding more bumps, if you like, to my hills. And now as I'm moving on to my second row, so these are the ones in the middle ground. They're a bit closer, so I'm going to make those slightly larger. And now for my third row in the foreground, these are the hills that are closest to me, so I'm just going to do 2 sort of large hills. Now I'm going to add in a winding road, which David Hockney puts in a lot of his landscapes, and that is going to help me give that illusion of perspective in the landscape. So as you can see, it starts off wider at the front and gets narrower as it disappears over the brow of the first hill, and then when it reappears in the second row it's smaller again, and then as it appears on the third row of hills it is just a single line disappearing into nothing. So then it looks like my road is disappearing off into the distance. Now I'm going to start to add in some little details which are also going to create that illusion of perspective in our landscape. So I'm doing the markings down the centre of the road, and like the road, they are also getting narrower the further away that they get. Now I'm going to add in a little fence along the side of my road. Now I could do a little wall if I wanted to, or you could do a wee hedge or something like that. So as you can see, my fence posts are getting smaller and smaller as they go off into the distance. And I'm actually going to bring them right along the front of my drawing as well. So they get shorter and shorter, and also they get closer together, and then when they reappear over the hill they're just little single lines disappearing almost into little tiny dots. So now I'm going to add in some of these really simple Hockney trees. I'm doing some just little pattern of curved lines to represent the leaves of my trees. You could also add in things like wind turbines perhaps far away on the hills, or you could add in some pylons, some little farmhouses, some hay bales, anything else that you think that you would find in a typical country landscape. So as you can see, I lost a wee bit of footage here, so it's jumped on slightly. So I've now divided up my fields. So the furthest away row of fields are smaller, and then the middle section of fields are a bit larger, and then at the front I've just left those 2 fields and I've not divided those up. So now I'm starting to fill in the fields with pattern, just like Hockney does in his landscapes. So I'm trying to do a whole variety of different patterns for each field. So remember, a pattern is when you're doing a repeated line or a repeated shape. So it's not just lots of random different shapes. So it's got to show repetition to be a pattern. If you are using coloured pens or coloured pencils, you could change up the colour each time. If you're just using pencil, just try and change up your pattern with each field that you do, so you've got a nice variety of patterns. So now moving on to the fields in the middle ground. So now these patterns are going to be a little bit larger. to show that these fields are closer to me. You can see in this field, as I get further away, the pattern is getting smaller and smaller to create that perspective. And sometimes I mix two patterns together. So in this field, I'm doing repeated wavy lines and repeated little circle shapes. Here I'm doing wavy lines again, but I've just changed up the direction of the lines. Now I'm on to my fields in the foreground, so this is where I want my patterns to be at their largest, to show that these are the closest to me. Now I'm just going back and filling in those little small fields in the distance. So I keep changing up the pattern every time, trying to think of different ways to use line or different shapes that I can repeat. So whether it's little dashes, whether it's broken lines, curved lines, wavy lines, zigzag lines, crisscross. So now that I've filled in all my fields, I'm moving on to the sky. So I'm using a spiral to represent the sun, and then I'm taking a bit of inspiration from a Van Gogh landscape, Van Gogh who we looked at last week. And I'm doing these little dashes radiating around the sun to show the glow of the rays of the sun, and some little curved lines to show the clouds in the sky. And then I'm doing these kind of swirly lines to make it look as if there is wind blowing across the sky. And then I'm just going to fill in the rest of the background with some little dots to complete my drawing. And there is my finished David Hockney inspired patterned landscape. So now I'm going to show you what it would look like if you did it in pencil. So you can see I've left a couple of the fields blank just so it didn't get too confusing and the patterns didn't merge together. So I did the sun slightly differently this time. I've used some diagonal lines to represent the rays of the sun just to show you a different option. And here I've added in some little pylons getting smaller as they go into the distance, and then a row of those little Hockney trees. There's another little farmhouse. I've done some hay bales in the field, and this time I've done a little brick wall along the side of my road instead of a fence. So there are two different options for our Hockney inspired landscape.